Dave Albers, founder of Revenue Connections, and I'm here on behalf of the client LCS Financial Services today. It's a nationwide collection agency, legal network that specializes in replevins, bankruptcy services, and pre- and post-judgment remedies. And I'm your moderator for the mainstream data panel this morning. We're fortunate to have the three primary providers of data services, TransUnion, Experian, and Equifax. And from Equifax, we have Brent Collette. He is the strategic automotive consultant for Equifax. From Experian, we have Paul Desaulniers. He's the senior director of risk scoring, trended data, and collections. And from TransUnion's automotive group, we have Rich Francisco, their VP for market development. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks. Thank you.
So, mainstream data. What is it? Yesterday there was a session, I think it was big data. Later this afternoon there's a session on alternative data, and really a lot about data. And we thought it was appropriate to get the view of the three primary credit providers, their view on what mainstream data is. Talk a little bit about what differentiates mainstream data from alternative data, how they're different, and how they relate. So we'll jump right into the questions with that. And because it's a small group, feel free to just throw up your hand or even just interject, and we'll keep it as informal and casual as possible. Let's go ahead. I'm going to ask. I'm going to ask each of our panelists their thoughts on this first question. Let's start with Rich. So can you define or provide perspective on mainstream versus alternative data, and specifically in the context of auto finance and recoveries?
Sure. So with the small audience, a number of you probably considered better experts at this topic than I am, and all of my colleagues here on the panel talk about as well. But so I think, given the number of sessions that we've had over the last couple of days on the similar subject, it can mean different things to different segments of the industry. And I think the CRAs have a kind of a unique view of the consumer from an FCRA and non-FCRA perspective. And maybe that's the best way to describe the difference.
And the CRAs being
FCRA, Fair Credit Reporting.
Not the CRAs being the credit reporting.
CRA Credit Reporting.
You guys.
The three of us. And FCRA, Fair Credit Reporting Act. So then you think about that data, you think about traditional and non-traditional consumer credit data. And then also public and proprietary non-credit consumer data. And that can come in different flavors, right? There's traditional point-in-time credit, trended credit data, and Paul is an expert on the trended subject. And then there's alternative consumer credit, and Randy knows a lot about that as well. And then you think about alternative data, it's well-used name for the data in the industry, but it can mean things like checking account data, utility, rental data, and small loan data that doesn't typically make it onto the consumer, not reported to the credit bureau. So there's a combination then of trended and alternative data. And then there's non-credit location data, so names and addresses and phones and vehicle sightings and all of that. And there's applications for this data across the consumer loan life cycle, right? So from marketing and acquisition to managing and then recovery, right? All these data points are used not interchangeably, but in conjunction and with each other at different points. And then I think having access to the data, or to all of these data points, has proven successful for our customers to solve specific challenges. And so an example of using that, pieces of that data in a recovery perspective is tying together, say, an early stage risk to roll model with contact information. And we've seen an increased appetite from our customers to prioritize further up in the queue those consumers who are more likely to go to later stages of default, right? And then with that contact information tied together, they are able to do some of the skip work further up in the funnel. So you can see they're using more traditional data along with alternative or non-credit data in the same thing. So,
so they're not competing, they're complementary.
They're complementary, and I think that the lines are blurring in some respect, and you can see the tying them together, lenders are getting the most value out of those data sets.
Right.
Yeah, so I wholeheartedly agree with what Rich just said. I mean, the way I always phrase it, there's three different data sets. There's big data, which really nobody knows what to do with at this point, because it's so loose and so messy, it's hard to contain. Then you have your traditional credit data, which is your scores, attributes that you get from one of the main CRAs. And then you have your alternative data, which is your factor trust clarities, those CoreLogics, those companies that have different trade lines that don't report on your traditional credit reporting bureau. And the last two, the traditional credit data and the alternative data, are all blurring together and melding to make scores more predictive, to help lenders make better decisions and be more profitable through the life cycle of the loan. And then you have, what Rich alluded to also, income and employment data, which can be used for underwriting loans, which can be used for collecting, prioritizing collections, which ones can pay, which ones can't, and also understanding if it's in a recovery mode, who's that company that they work for? Do we have garnishment information on them? Yes, then we can start that legal process as well. And then it all starts at the beginning with the right contact information. If you don't have the right contact information, you can't collect them. And so understanding, does that same person still own that cell phone that when they first opened the loan, or has it transitioned to somebody else to avoid TCPA regulations and those kinds of things? So all that data is melding together. Each of us own different entities within that, and there's also great standalone companies as well that lenders utilize and are very beneficial to the process.
I would agree with most of my colleagues on the panel. I always break it down real simple. I think the simple plan is the best. Traditional data stuff traditionally reported to a national credit reporting agency. Non-traditional data would be things that aren't traditionally reported to a national credit reporting agency. Makes it real clear, and just reiterate the points is, what do you need to do? I need to contact the consumer. That starts. If someone doesn't pay, what do I need to do? I need to contact them. How do you get that contact information? Well, if the contact information is out there, the power is understanding the logic of prioritizing what's the best phone number, what's the best address to contact the consumer. So I think logic plays a whole lot. How many times do I see this phone number and address reported with that consumer through multiple data sources, and being able to build that logic in to say, here's the number that I want to call first, here's the address I want to mail first. That's really the key of it here. It's not big data. Big data's out there. Big data can just say, you get paralysis. I got all this data, I don't know what to do. It's the logic of prioritizing what's the best phone number, because at the end of the day, that's what you need, is the best contact information for that consumer. Not, I got 25 deep contact information. Calling where a guy had a phone number 5 years ago isn't not going to help you solve your collections problem today.
So Brett, I know that Equifax, amongst many other products, has the work number and first search, just to name a couple. How do you do most lenders? How do you see most lenders using these tools? And what other data tools do you see being used by various users of that data?
Yeah, so there's, within the life cycle loan, they use it at different stages, right? So the lenders that are doing it the best and have the best congruency, they're starting at the beginning at origination, capturing that data there. When they refresh their portfolios, they're capturing it there as well. but they're not keeping it in silos, they're sharing it across the life cycle of the loan. So that when it comes to recovery time, they have all that information passed to them and it's in their system, in their servicing systems. I was with a lender just a few weeks ago. They buy data from all three of us on a monthly basis. It sits within their portfolio risk management group and goes nowhere else. That doesn't benefit the organization the most it can for the value of that data. So if you're going to spend it in one area, you might as well spread it out across the areas as well. And the earlier you do that in the cycle is the best. So we're talking income and employment data that can be used to help underwrite a loan, make sure that you validate the payment to income ratios, make sure that they can afford that car. Then there's the first search collection contact data, which updates phone numbers, and there's addresses that we get from a consortium that we have, where we have 95% plus coverage of all the different cell phones, utility companies. So if someone moves and takes their cell phone with them or changes cell phones, they have to have a new address. We capture that information and pass that along as well. And then using that same data set, understanding for TCPA purposes, which customers no longer own their cell phones and they've moved on to somebody else. So if Paul had the cell phone, now it's mine, and you're calling me instead of Paul, one, it doesn't do you any good, and two, it could end up being a
TCPA violation.
So, and you get fined for it. So knowing all of that, the earlier you do it in the cycle of the loan and tying it all together, the better it's going to work out in the end.
So Paul, similar question. What Experian tools and data sources are driving more effective RPC gathering?
Yeah, it's not only, I think there's something that we all need to come to terms with, and collections hasn't changed in 30 years. How do I get in contact with a consumer who hasn't paid? I send them a dunning letter and I pick up the phone and call them. But the consumer has fundamentally changed over the last 5 years. Ask everyone in this room, every lender that I deal with, they have a digital acquisition strategy. So they prospect digitally, they acquire digitally. Who here doesn't want to service their customer digitally? I think everyone does, because self-serve is the cheapest form of interacting with a consumer. When a consumer goes to collections, what do? I'm going to call the consumer. I'm going to send them a letter. Well, the consumer has been serviced digitally from acquisition through account management. When they go past due, you have to contact that consumer digitally, and understanding the channel that the consumer wants to be contacted with is key. Understanding, phone and letter, there's no one that I know that says my right party contact rates are going up. We just did a study recently, and bucket 1 and 2, less than 10% are right party contacts. So I'm not contacting 90% of the people that are past due. They want to get text, they want to get email. That's how you reach out to your consumer and deal with them on a digital basis. Say, hey, Paul, I can send you an email. Does everyone know this? 85% of texts are open within 2 minutes. 85% of texts are open within 2 minutes. You drop that in front of the consumer, boom, they click, they say, Paul, you're past due. What can we do to start resolving this debt? And you do a virtual negotiation session with them to resolve that debt. And we're seeing significant inroads of that methodology of dealing with the consumer, how they want to be dealt with, when they want to be dealt with, not through collection actors. So that's one of the things that we're really seeing as a trend in the back end of the business, is getting a proper and effective digital collection strategy. So a little off our topic, but that's a piece of what's the channel, is understanding the channel mix is key. What's the best channel to contact the consumer? And don't limit it to just phone and letter.
I think it's in line with what we're talking about. I mean, we're talking about right party contacts and using mainstream data. Rich, do you have some thoughts that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would second what Paul just said on the innovation front. And I think lenders are always looking for a way to get an edge, right, and improve collections and recovery, and in using unique data. Right, it's what's important or critical is their ability to access that data at the right place and the right time and through the right platform. And I think we heard that yesterday in the executive panel with the gentleman from Ally and World Omni Pelican, and they, if you were there, you heard them talk about the ability to ingest big data, and that can mean a lot of different things as well. But you know, big data can stress an organization. You have to be able to take in that data. You have to be able to do something with it. It takes a lot of time from analysts, but having a platform then to do something with it is absolutely critical. And so that's what we're seeing from the innovation front, different trends. You know, an example is alluding to some of the things you were just talking about, right party contact, is if a lender in a recovery stage can triangulate between phones and addresses and then location data, so vehicle sightings from a DRN, for example. A lender can, with very precise accuracy, figure out that a vehicle is going to be in a certain place at a certain time and improve the ability to go and repossess that vehicle. So that's a trend, certainly I think a trend we're seeing, probably we're all seeing. It's ability to take those, again, disparate data sources and tie them together and just make their processes more efficient.
So kind of staying on this track, and we've done it, taken it, the use of mainstream data to get right party contacts. Well, what's the whole maybe waterfall? What do each of you see in terms of how you would set up a waterfall to maximize the use of mainstream data, leverage the alternative data, and maybe even use some of these alternative channels to make that contact? What are your thoughts, Paul?
I kind of see this exactly as that. And there's two costs to this equation. When I look at, and I'm going to hit the alternative data first. When I look at alternative data, I look at it through two axes. And the alternative data world falls underneath Experian also. I look under how predictive is the data source, and then what's the coverage of that data source across the consumer population. And what you find is mainstream data, call it whatever you want, traditional bureau data, is, it's ubiquitous coverage. So you're going to capture everybody, and that's typically going to be, there's also an expense curve here too. You need to understand what's the expense of each of these data sources as I build my skip waterfall. So I want to utilize first, what data is going to drive the best contact rate at the best prices, and then you also, I keep on going back to understanding the channel that consumer wants to be dealt with. And just because I have great phones and I can give you the phone number, doesn't mean the consumer wants to be contacted. I don't know if you're familiar with the Privacy Star app. It comes preloaded on all track phones. It captures phone calls coming in, and the consumer just hits a button, it packages those phone calls up, sends them to a TCPA attorney to file a lawsuit on it. Comes loaded on every track phone. I mean, so you need to understand how the consumer has technologies that they've never had before that make it very difficult to contact them in methods they don't want to be contacted. So you have to mix what's my best data sources to give me the overall arching contact information to the consumer, and then tie in what's the probable contact method. How does that consumer want to be contacted? And that's how you get the best results, by mixing these all together in your waterfall, not saying, hey, I'm going to go with only alternative data, I'm going to go with only traditional data. You have to marry these things together to get the best action for that consumer at the time. We always talk about it as, what's the best action at that time for the consumer? I'll just throw some statistics at you. When people hit a link to pay a bill on a collection account, 50% of the people who hit a link make a payment. So if you can drive a link in front of them, you can see massive results that you don't see over the phone and through Dunning letters. So I keep going back that you have to add digital to your mix to be effective in this day and age, and they're just the facts of the matter.
Brett, your thoughts on it?
Yeah, and I agree with the digital part. Consumers have changed, caller IDs everywhere. You can ignore a phone call as easy as anything these days. Me and my grandmother had caller ID. Wouldn't answer the phone anymore. So it has changed drastically. But to the data point, I think it goes back to, again, the beginning. How well at the onset of the loan did you capture the data that you need to make contacts later? In your portfolio reviews, are you getting all this data in a timely monthly basis and able to segment it out to see how it changes over time? Then you know where to start. And then once you start there, then you have to take next steps to use other data sources, whether it's location or what have you, to go find where that vehicle may be or where that consumer may be. But it starts all at the beginning, and the better job you do at the top and in the middle to understand the changes as it goes along, the easier it will be on the backside.
Rich?
Yeah, I think, so I absolutely agree. And going back to one of the first points I made, so the same data that lenders are using to make better decisions at the beginning, up front, in underwriting, you know, that same data can be leveraged, or is leveraged, in the recovery phase and risk scoring for recovery. So, you know, you think about the richer credit data from trended credit data. You have a better view of a consumer's ability to pay. You have a better view of their capacity, and in fact, you have a view of when they might have more disposable income, so to speak, based on their excess payments. Right? You can learn that from the trended credit data. That can be leveraged in the recovery phase to identify a consumer who might be in late stage delinquency who now has the ability to make a payment. Right? That's very valuable for auto lenders to leverage, and we see that in the space as well.
And just to build on what he said on the trended data part, you could have a consumer that you notice just started running up credit cards and maintaining balances where they paid it off previously. So that could be a signal of trouble, right? You want to treat them differently than you treat somebody that still pays their credit cards every month in full. You probably do. You probably want to call them first, call them most often, call them every day that you can. But that's how the trended data can be extremely helpful in collections.
And just to reiterate on 2 points, an excellent point about the front end of your acquisition process, making sure that you're capturing consent. Do I have consent to text you? Do I have your email address? Do I have consent to send you an email? Capturing that on the front end of your business will make collecting on the back end significantly more effective and easier. And to the point about trended data, you'll see payment behavior on trended data change 90 to 120 days before you see any change in the person's risk score. So understanding the trend of that consumer, you'll see changes in that payment behavior long before you'll see any change in a credit score or a recovery score. So understanding how you can utilize that information will be very effective on how you prioritize who you want to collect on.
So we just have a few minutes left, and I do want to open it up to the audience. Do we have any questions for these guys?
I'm interested in the back end and the front end. Do you see any of your customers that are really tying the back and the front end together as far as the data goes? As far as on the front end they're using X data, on the back end they're using Y data. You know, I mean, the front end says, I could have collected that. The back end says, I would have never bought that.
That's the problem, right?
I would have never bought that.
Are you seeing anybody actually really take the data on the front that they bought and tying it to the results on the back and then communicating back and forth?
I think you're missing one piece of it though, and you know, you see that all the time, but you're missing the management piece of that. Understanding how the risk of the consumer changes over time.
Yes.
I think as auto loans go deeper and deeper, you know, you're past the 60-month loan now.
Yeah, it's not the same loan.
It's not the same
guy.
loan. It changes over time. So there's a piece of that you have to understand, and that's proper account management in between.
Yeah. That's why you call it the life cycle for a reason, right? It should all connect to each other. There should be feedback from back to front and front to back.
Right.
And the best lenders and the ones that collect the best, they do that. But that's, from my experience and talking with lenders, is fewer and far between than you're like. I mean, even when I was in the lending space, it wasn't as good as it should have been, right?
Yeah.
And so that's something that I think the industry as a whole can improve on.
I don't monopolize, but the other thing I was going to ask you about the trending data. So when you said it takes 90 days for the FICO to change, so a lot of collection sites will look at the FICO, but that's really not what's important. You're saying what's more important is look at what's trending data.
I got to tell everybody something about FICO. Let's just be, if you're using FICO version 2, which is utilized the most, that's a 20-year-old score. Who here thinks that the consumer behaves the same way today that they did 20 years ago? Right. Is there anyone in the room who thinks that? So if you're still using that score, you know, you're doing yourself a total disservice. With the NCAP changes that happened at the Bureau over the summer, that score is no longer predictive. If that's what you're using to assess risk, you're doing yourself a disservice. Even FICO 8 was pre-recession behavior of the consumer. So if you're utilizing these old scores, they do not predict risk as they should. So you're doing yourself a total disservice and your business a disservice if you're utilizing those old legacy models.
Yeah, and even within FICO, I mean, it's a good baseline, right? It gives you an understanding. I might have 12% loss versus a 5% loss expectancy. But within each band, we could have the same credit score and perform completely differently based off of that traded data. I could be could have lost my job, could be, you know, I could be going one way, they could be going the other way, and perform completely differently. So it's important to understand that throughout the life cycle.
Is anybody using social data where they're like, hey, I changed my status to unemployed on LinkedIn looking for a job, or anybody got there yet?
You're going to be in regulatory hell if you do that.
Is that right? Some providers, some data
Regulatory hell.
providers who are starting to collect and mine that, whether they, I don't.
Can't make a decision on it, but you could use it for collection purposes?
So social media contact points, yeah, yes, it's non-SCRA.
Yeah, you're not making a decision. You're just saying, oh, this
Just
guy's life
location.
might have changed. I might need to reach out to him a little sooner to help him out.
Or where you're at, based on, you know, I'm moving, but I'm not.
The location data is one thing I would agree with, but if you're utilizing that to adverse act on the consumer,
Yeah.
you're going to be in a world of hurt. A world of hurt.
So I think
Yeah.
The consumer, you can't display it to the consumer, and the consumer can't dispute it. If you're going to use something in a decisioning process, they are two FCRA tenants. You have to be able to display it, have to be able to dispute it.
And really talking about other, you know, non-traditional data, there's a company like, you know, SoFi in the unsecured space, or even student lending, who are, you know, really non-traditional ways of underwriting and thinking about, you know, whether they leverage traditional credit debt or not, I'm not 100% certain, but they do things very, very differently, and I'm not sure that would entirely work in audit.
Yeah.
I think we had one more question from the audience. Jason, did you have?
Yeah, this was a question to talking about trended data. What types of things are you putting together to make the data digestible for the collections efforts? For example, like one thing that we see when we look for triggers on credit search. Well, if I have the profile of a credit shopper in recovery, I know I've got a great top up, and I can actually kind of profile that customer and tailor my communication to that customer incredibly differently if I know that this customer is fitting into this sort of like behavior at this particular time. And that's data that we don't, you know, it's very hard for us to kind of trend and see, and then consume, digest, and then profile. Are your organizations thinking about products in that line?
There's two ways to get trended data. You can get the raw trended, which are called the 5 fields, the most important being actual payment. That's one way of digesting the data. And then I need an analytics shop to understand that data. I have to build it all and build all my solutions out, which is a long and arduous task. You can also buy off-the-shelf solutions that are attributes that talk to all of those things. And that's easily digestible from any organization. I've personally had credit unions come to me and say, I want the raw trended data. It's like, how many analysts do you have? We don't have any analysts. Well, sending you a file of raw trended data will crash your system and you'll get no value out. No, I demand the raw trended. Like, let me show you an attribute that combines all that information and gives you a usable asset to utilize. So you have to understand what you're getting, and for any organization, you can use the attributes that the bureaus build. I build them, each of my colleagues build them, to give you immediate, actionable information and insight on that consumer without going through that analytics effort.
I'm seeing though that even in the attribute list, that list is getting longer and longer and longer. And then it's becoming more difficult to say, okay, well now I've got 6,000 attributes. Now what do I do with it? And how do I test them? Which ones actually combine and determine? And you know, for smaller organizations, I think your point is spot on. Is you don't have the analytical horsepower to, you know, consume it and then make it actionable.
You need to ask I would ask your bureau or your data provider representative, because I guess if we arm our consultants, I'm sure my two competitors, my two colleagues up here, they do the same thing. They're arming their consulting staffs with, here are the best things, here are the best attributes for this type of use. And that should get you what you need.
Yeah, I mean, I know from our perspective, we have suites of attributes for each industry, for each vertical. And so we have it narrowed down for auto what predicts
in auto.
Yeah, what's the most predictive in auto? And so it's narrowed down from the 700 or 1,000 that we have to 20 or 30. So that's how we help. This is what helps in auto and is most predictive.
So we run over by just a few minutes.
It's that interesting.
It is that interesting. So we thought it would go short.
Yeah.
I want to thank you, gentlemen, for taking the time to be here today and for sharing your insights. Very, very helpful. So if we could give a big round of applause.